kinds of losses that produce grief other than the death of an individual? A job. Okay. Job. I live in Huntsville, Alabama. Redstone Arsenal. NASA, Army. Both places there on Redstone. I know of individuals that have worked there for 30 plus years. Without any warning at all, they show up on Monday morning and there's a supervisor that says they'd like to talk to you in the head office. They go to the head office. There's a couple of people there along with the witness as well. And they said, we'd like to thank you for your 30 plus years of very faithful service to our company. Tragically, we are downsizing and we are doing away with your job. Thank you again for your service. Here are your papers. Here is your severance pay. We need you to sign this note notifying that you understand that your job is over, and these guards will see you to the gate within the next 2 hours, and they'll follow you wherever you go in our building. Who's going to grieve that evening from the loss of a job?
Probably the entire family.
Anybody and everybody connected to that individual, including the church. Because if you think about it, they may not be able to financially support the church like they did before because they've lost a job. Stress, worry, grief, aggravation, anger. I mean, you could just run the gamut of a loss of a job. And yet, unfortunately, we do not validate that loss like we do when someone's loved one dies. Well, for them, they've died, at least in the sense of that job that they part. Because think about it. For many of us, and I include myself, we find our self-worth in what? What we do. Many men are that way. Some women are that way. So there's a great grief there involved with the idea of a loss of a job. Someone said the loss of a marriage. I assume we're talking about divorce. Divorce. Regardless of what the circumstances are, divorce is always a terrible grief loss. Because why? It involves, again, not just two individuals, but their parents, their children if children are involved, the grandparents, the friends, the church, everybody. It's like throwing a little rock in a very quiet pond. The rippling effect is just devastating. And then particularly, obviously, if someone in the marriage was unfaithful and someone was trying to be faithful and trying to do what was right, and they do everything they can within their power to make the marriage work again, and that individual is not interested in doing that, then you got that situation to deal with. I have a dear friend that had to face that years ago, and they said to me one day, I would give anything to go to the graveyard and visit my ex's grave. Now, they were not wishing harm on their former mate. What they were saying, because they explained that, I would love to have some closure. And there was no closure, and there is no closure. In this particular regard, they had done everything they could to keep the marriage together, The other individual, not interested. And so after the divorce, this individual was running around town with you know what, with whom, and it's just making a mockery of what that person stood for religiously and the vows that they had said that they were going to be faithful about. Divorce is always a terrible loss. Other kind of losses. Freedom. What do you mean by that? Okay. Incarceration. Because you find out when those, in his case, when those bars of the jail cells close. Wow. Life changes. And it not only changes for that individual, but for everybody else connected to that situation. So incarceration is a terrible grief loss. Other losses. Yes, sir.
When we have a brother or sister that falls away or
Okay, apostasy. Someone who was religious that was there, they used to be here right at this building or my building where I preach in Huntsville, Alabama, and they're no longer there. And they're out living a life different from what they used to live, with no faith evidently involved. And that hurts. Who does it hurt? Moms and dads and sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and church members and everybody. It hurts everybody. Because they used to be right here. And they're not here anymore. And the guilt that individuals feel, typically parents, first and foremost, because they tried their very best to do everything that they could possibly do. I always try to encourage people when we talk about this one, please don't ever give up on them. Please do wherever you can do. A card, a call, a visit, a text, if it needs to be impersonal, just something to let them know, I miss seeing you. I love and pray for you. I mean, that may be all you can do, but that's a start. It is a start. Other losses. Yes, ma'am. I want to let you go first.
The loss of a friendship.
Yes, friendship. Yeah. And that loss of friendship, typically, we don't become friends and for 5 minutes. I mean, we have it for many years. And when we lose a friend, and again, I don't even know what the factors might have been, but when we lose that friendship, does it hurt us? Deeply. It's like someone stuck a knife in you and turned the blade because you and them had a relationship that was special, that was unique, unlike any others that you have. A friendship. Other losses. Yes, ma'am. Moving away. When we move away, the next town is always going to be better. Maybe, maybe not. Yeah, this happens often when it comes to older individuals. Mom and dads are to the point that they no longer need to stay by themselves or stay in the home where they used to live. And so therefore we have to make the decision and try to say, okay, let's move them somewhere. What has mom and dad lost? Familiarity of a community, their home or their house that they lived in for 50 years, their doctors, their church, their friends, their freedom. I mean, and we want. I had someone call me one day. Mom doesn't seem to be doing too well around here. What can you do, preacher? I said, well, let's talk about what happened. And they told me, well, Mom moved. We had to move her because of some of her memory issues. And I said, well, how long has she been here? He said 3 months. And said she just doesn't go anywhere. Well, I wanted to say, duh. But think about the things that Mom's having to process here. A lot of change. And the older we get, we don't like that word and we don't want to use that word. Moving away. And then also, when we move away from our friends that we used to be able to spend time with and enjoy and see on a daily basis. So that's a terrible grief loss. And think about it. Everyone in the family structure is involved in that. The kids are going to grieve. The mom and dad's are going to grieve. The dog's going to grieve. I mean, seriously, all kinds of things are going to happen because moving away. Other losses. Yes, ma'am. Time. Now, what do you mean by that?
I thought of it like in two ways. I thought of time, like time in the past, different memories, and then time of what we should have done or we said we were going to do. I always think around graduation time, where will we be in 10 years? And if you have these books, you go back and look, like, that is not where I am. That is not where I went in 10 years or 20 years.
I've never had that. That's a great answer. I have to add that to my list. Time. And we can say all we want to about time is what you make it to be, and but the point of the matter is it's so easy to take time and life for granted where we are, and we forget it's constantly moving. Regardless of whether we like to admit it or not, it is constantly moving. One direction or the other.
Even with the apostasy, because you run out of time.
Exactly.
Are you where you need to be or where you want to go?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's an excellent comment. You said you were going to say something a minute ago. What?
Pets.
Pets. You mean we grieve over pets?
Sometimes they can be your best friend.
Yes, they. We grew up in Northport, Alabama, which is right next door to Tuscaloosa, and Dad was the minister there for 56 years. When we were small, we got a dachshund dog, registered, AKA she was Gretchen Dauphine II. We thought surely no one would think of the word Gretchen Dauphine. They said there's one, she's the second. I said okay. So that was her registered name. Heidi was smarter than Cindy and Don and I because she was much easier to train than we were, Mom and Dad said. She was very easy to train. 2, she was very, very smart. She'd let you know exactly where things were and what they needed to be. We always say that she was definitely a preacher's dog because she loved the Word of God. She chewed up 5 Bibles. She was very evangelistic. She ate several soles of shoes. And then on one occasion, she was cleansed and sanctified. She ate a whole box of X-Lax and lived to tell about it, or lived to live through that, as someone said, live through that moving experience. When Heidi died, when Mom and Dad they had to make the decision to put her down, we were all adults. We'd all married. There were 8 grown adults bawling their eyes out because that dog was a part of our family. I taught some classes at Laughlin Funeral Home in Huntsville. I had a lady come and tell me one day she had a dear friend whose son, he was a very successful financial person there in Huntsville, had a cat that developed a disease. The guy had already spent $25,000, and this was 15 years ago, on trying to keep that cat alive, and even flown it to England for special treatment. And the lady was telling me this. She said, "What do you think about that?" I wanted to say what I really thought. I said, "He very much evidently loves that cat. It's a part of his life." We see that's what pets are. And so when we lose them, when I hear about our kids at church whose loved one, whose pet died, I send them a letter of sympathy. I really do. Because to them, it is a real loss. I've done that to some of our adults as well. Because that pet was more than just an animal. Particularly think about the scenario of a pet being given to you by a loved one who is now passed, and thus that pet becomes even more special to them. Yeah. Other kind of losses.
Personal possessions.
I'm sorry, what?
Personal possessions.
Personal possessions. Yeah. Anybody ever been robbed? Anybody ever had things taken from them? It's a terrible feeling. When we were in Evergreen, someone broke into our house when we were gone, and they took things from our house, got on the computer and typed and left us a message. Now that'll freak you out. Seriously. That was bizarre. We didn't sleep too well for those next few days. And I got to know the chief of police real well. In fact, that's when I became a chaplain, when he came over to the house to sort of see what was going on. Terrible. It makes you feel violated. You feel threatened because someone came into your stuff, into your house. And again, you can talk about all the stuff that you want to. But when that stuff were the kids' stuff and they just tore it up instead of taking it with them, man, that'll scare you to death. Personal possessions. Yeah. Other losses. Yes, sir.
How about this one? My grief is based on my horse coming in last in the Kentucky Derby because I already had the money spent on a new car or a new boat.
Okay.
False sense of grief.
I guess that would be definitely a false sense of grief. I don't ever watch the Kentucky Derby, but I am glad that I happened to caught it right before the race, because they spend 3 hours talking about that, and I decided to watch. It was an exciting, just the horse race. It was an exciting, who could have written a script like that? Seriously. But yeah, I guess that's a false sense of grief in several different kinds of ways. So, other losses.
Your health.
Definitely your health. Oh my word. We take everything for granted that we can do anything until we can't anymore. Exactly. And it affects everyone else around you. You mentioned a few moments ago freedom. Well, think about that from a perspective of loss of health. Having to make the decision to talk to mom and dad said, you don't need to drive anymore. Give me your car keys. Or moving them from somewhere and said, we will come pick you up. What happened to my car? Well, it's gone. Health, all related to health issues. Yes, ma'am.
What I think about that sometimes I think other people don't think about is loss of self.
Loss of what?
Self.
Loss of self.
I would probably put in that category like women that are abused or men that are abused and they suffer in silence many times.
Yeah.
And so they've lost themselves because
Yeah.
of
That's an excellent. Someone mentioned a few months ago after we got back doing workshops after COVID that they had lost, in fact they had loss of self that equaled a loss of purpose. because they weren't able to do what they had been able to do before COVID, and this was somewhere up north where they had got a little more serious about it and took it more seriously than you folks in Florida did, and that's not I'm not disrespecting that in any kind of way. I'm just announcing because I know what your governor said, and we did pretty much the same thing in Alabama, but they were up north and they said we were locked down. Literally, you couldn't go anywhere, and that began to bother me about what I could not do, which therefore seemed to be, okay, now what do I do in my life? So that's an excellent point. Let me just give you a few others. Loss of a part of a body, which obviously were related to health. Separation of a child, someone that's disabled. Could retirement be considered a loss, a grief loss?
No.
He says no. But I've had many women tell me, believe me, I started grieving the day my husband retired and came home. You ladies know what I'm talking about. In fact, one lady said, here's the solution, go back to work. I'm going to leave him home and I'm going back to work. Retirement, drugs, alcohol, financial setbacks, mental health, loss of a parent in the sense of them leaving and never coming back to the family situation, infertility, PTSD, war, threat of terrorism, loss of confidence either in self or in someone else. Well, you see the point I'm making. All of these things that we talked about and many, many more that we could talk about all relate to things other than the loss of an individual and death. Yet they still produce grief. The reason we spend time with this is because we hopefully have expanded your horizon and your perspective of understanding. The next time you hear someone in regard to some of these things we've talked about, the first thing I want you to remember is they're grieving. They're hurting. Now, others may not think that, but they are. Okay? All right, the second handout that you have in front of you. Grief. Now, what you have there in front of you is a good Webster Dictionary definition of what grief is. But we want to do more than just that. You know, Mr. Webster is an individual experience, generally a painful feeling of sorrow or sadness that either follows an actual loss or precedes an anticipatory loss. But let's do more than that. So for the next few minutes, I want us to think about grief in this way. Think of, and I didn't do a real good job marking this out. I want to do that better. Okay. Think of something that's related to grief that starts with the letter G. And I'll give you the first one. God. Isn't God involved in our grief? Should be. Doesn't God play a role in how we look at grief and how we grieve and what we think about in regard to our grief? Well, sure He does. So think of some words that begin with the letter G that is related to grief. Greed.
In a sense of we want what we want, and sometimes, well, God knows what's best for us.
Okay. Well, see, I was coming from another perspective. Unfortunately, many times in a grief loss, there are people that start thinking about greed in regard to, okay, what's mine now? And believe me, they had to stop a fight in the funeral home setting of a place that I know, because even before the funeral, because loved ones were already fighting over the stuff, and they had to call the police in, because that's all they were interested in, is what's going to be mine. Other words. Ooh, that's a great one. Guilt. Why do we feel guilty sometimes when it comes to grief?
Did we spend enough time with it?
Because the should have, could have, would have's, we didn't spend enough time. If we should, we should have seen that coming. We could have done this. We had a lady that stopped that told us one time in a workshop, I feel so guilty. What am I going to do with my guilt? I said, ma'am, can you explain? Well, we were all taking turns taking care of mom and dad, but particularly with dad's illness, and said, I had been there all week long, and said, then I drove home to be with my family, and one of my siblings came, and it was their turn to be there. I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, and my dad died, and I feel so guilty because I wasn't there. I said, ma'am, did your dad love you? Yes. Did you love your dad? Yes. You spent a week with him, right? She said, yeah. I said, ma'am, you're not feeling guilt. I said, you just told me how much you love your dad. That's what that was. You weren't there, but your dad knew where you were. And your dad loved you and you loved him. But a lot of times we feel guilt because those should have, could have, would have's always come about, and they sometimes haunt us because of the way that we sort of look at our lives. Another word, letter G.
Goofy.
What?
Goofy.
Goofy, yeah. Grief makes us feel goofy, strange. We can't think straight. We can't function straight. Had a lady one time. I got to remember that we're sort of close to that place that I used to live, so I've got to be careful what I say here. But there was a lady that came to our class one time, and she said, I looked for my glasses for 3 hours. Guess where they were? Top of her head. One lady told us, she came in and she said, I always have a habit. I come in, I take the frozen stuff, I put it in the freezer, and then I go to my bedroom and I put my keys underneath my pillow, because that way I don't ever, because they're right there. I've misplaced them before. And she had dealt with a grief loss. So that particular day, she came in, she had her bacon that she was going to put in the freezer, she had her keys that she was going to put underneath her pillow, and guess what? She went to bed that night, guess what was there? Her bacon. Guess where her keys were? In the freezer. It affects us that way. We don't think clearly. It's sort of a foggy brain. We got too much on our plate. Our mind's just racing through all the scenarios, all the decisions, all the things that have to be done. And then on top of that, we're hurting deeply. So sometimes grief does make us feel very goofy. What else? Letter G.
Maybe generous, maybe we start giving.
Generous? It would be nice if others were generous toward us, and hopefully they are. It's nice, it's good to have people that are kind and loving when we need them the most. And that's a time of grief. In times of grief, we need people that really are generous toward us and care for us. I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about acts of kindness that they give. How about this one? Give up. Is it possible sometimes in grief that we think we just want to give up? I want to act like this never happened. And there are people that feel that way sometimes. I just want to surrender it all. I just want to quit thinking about all these decisions that I have to make. How about grave, which is a double meaning, Grave, gone, goodbye. Gratitude, grouchy. Had someone feel like that, they said, it's just like, I think that it's not going to get any worse, and guess what? It does. Ghastly. It's just beyond comprehension in regard to what we're dealing with. Okay, the letter R. Think of some words that start with the letter R. Regret. Again, the would've, could've, should've's. Regret. I wish I could have. I'm sorry that I did say. I'm sorry that I didn't do. You see the point. Regret. Remorse, which is somewhat kin to that. What else? Relief. Sir, you mentioned that a little while ago in regard to the situation you were talking about. The person's feeling a lot of relief from the situation. And in some respects, particularly if we've been there and done what we could do for an individual, there is a sense of relief because they're no longer suffering. And more importantly, hopefully, they're in a far better place that God planned for them to have. And so it's sort of a preacher friend of ours we saw at a Bible lectureship program. I extended my sympathy to him whose father had died a few weeks after our father died. And he said, well, I'm in trouble at church because everybody's mad at me. I said, what are they mad about? He said, I haven't grieved. My dad was ready to go. He could not wait to leave this life. And I said, well, I'm somewhat to feel the same way. So there's a sense of relief there. Is that somewhat what you were talking about? Okay, because it can be taken, I know, a different kind. What? Rejoice, yeah. Again, the idea of rejoicing. And again, I'm not saying that fits every situation because it certainly does not. It certainly does not. But in that scenario, there's that situation. What else?
Talk about kids being resilient. Talk about children and the grief process, but we need to remember most kids are very resilient.
Yes, resilient. And what did you say?
Like retrospect.
Retrospect, yeah. Which would also remind you of remembrance. Yeah. Yeah, as Don already said, Sunday morning at the 9 o'clock hour, Don will be in here talking about how to minister to the hurting, which is not just for people that are grieving, but also for caregivers, is what Don will be dealing with. Somewhere in the building, where? Room 107, I'll be talking to adults about how children grieve. And they are very resilient. I sure am glad God made them that way, because we mess up sometimes as big adults in regard to taking care of them. Other words with the letter R, that start with the letter R.
What about respect?
Respect.
Of the person that's grieving.
Okay. Oh, that's a great one. Respect for the person that is grieving. Yeah. Because they need respect.
Not putting pressure on them.
Not putting them in a box. Not saying in grief we make the mistake of thinking that everybody ought to grieve one way. Which way is that? The way I'm grieving. If you're not grieving the way I'm grieving, then guess what? Who's abnormal? You see, that's the way we look at it. And therefore, we don't give respect to people that are grieving differently than I'm grieving, or the other people around you. They deserve respect. They deserve respect. And we need to give that to them. How about this one? Rage. Rage. Some things happen that are so terrible that are so debilitating, that are just so awful, horrendous to even think about, that it just produces a lot of rage in a person.
Against God as well.
Against God as well. Exactly. Or against, typically in a grief situation, people will get, if they're dealing with rage, they will get mad at God, the doctors, the hospital, the funeral home director, the preacher, or other family members. I mean, the list could go on and on and on, because you see, they don't want to point the finger at me, but they want to point the finger at somebody else, because they're just so overwrought with all these terrible, powerful feelings that they've never felt before. And so rage is a real grief issue. It can occur. It really can. I know it was a Hollywood movie, but it illustrates it so well. Ladies, I know you can quickly go to this particular scene of the movie Still Magnolias. Sally Field, her husband, her daughter Julia Roberts has died. They're at the graveside. Their friends are there. They're saying all the different things. And Sally Fields and her character says what? I just want to hit someone. I want to just hit someone and make them feel as bad as I feel. Anybody remember the next line?
Take a whack at Weezer.
Yeah, someone take a whack at Weezer. And they pull out, what was that lady's name? Anyway, we know the Hollywood movie. And every time I look at that, I said, that's the way sometimes people feel. They really are just so mad because they're hurting so terribly that they'll do some really strange things. But there may be some wheezes around in the world that you'd like to hit, simply because you just feel so much rage, and that's real. Which is another thing, real. Yeah, this is real, or reality. Okay, the letter I. Intentional. Thank you. What did you mean by that?
I think this kind of goes back to that respect notion of not everybody grieves the same way. We need to be mindful of, I don't know exactly how you feel. I can only imagine how you feel.
Yeah. In fact, Don said, I don't know, I can only imagine how you feel. I usually say, I can't even imagine how you feel. Because you see, by saying that, I'm saying, there's no way I can understand what you're going unless you want to tell me. Then I'll sit there and listen with you and listen to you. But the point of the matter is, it is intentional.
And we have to make for those of us who are helping others grieve, we need to be part of their lives.
Exactly. And you've got, in order to be a part of someone else's life, you've got to be sure that they're comfortable with you around them. Well, you do that by intentional kindness and love toward them. Exactly. Other words with the letter I. Indifferent. Or indifference. Yes, ma'am, you said individual. Thank you. We are as individual. Grief is we're as only individual as ourselves and the grief loss that we are dealing with. We bring our own idiosyncrasies, our own ideations, our own thought patterns to any grief loss. Therefore, we could, if we were all in this room together, or those who are online, and we were all grieving over the same person, guess what? You're going to grieve as an individual. I'm going to grieve as an individual, even over the same loss. Because we're all different, which therefore explains why people do different things when it comes to grief, and that's okay. As long as it's cathartic, as long as it's helpful, as long as it's not hurting them or others, it's okay. Other words with the letter I.
Ignorant.
Ooh.
People that don't really understand, the ones that say, I know exactly how you feel.
They don't. They just don't. They don't have a clue. Intent. And then here's one, intense, because grief is very intense at times. Very serious matter. How about, which is another thing. Sometimes it makes us feel irrational. Or we may do things that are irrational. Obviously, illness is another word. Which, here's another one. Insane. People sometimes make us feel like we're insane, or we make ourselves feel like that we're insane. I've had people say, I paid the utility bill twice. I forgot to pay the cable bill one time. Cut off my cable. What was really bad was a lady said, I was going to leave the house to go to the mailbox, and I was in the middle of the outside the house, and I started thinking about my grief situation, and I literally couldn't think, was I going to the mailbox or was I leaving the mailbox and going back to the house? She said, I'm losing it. I'm losing it. That's a feeling of grief many times. The letter E. Ego.
Ego.
Eagle. What do you mean by eagle?
I'm the suffering hero and desire attention in the room.
Oh. Are you saying EGO?
Yes.
Okay, I thought you said eagle. Sorry. And I was thinking, okay. Yeah, well, but
From up north.
that's okay. I am too, North Alabama. Yes. Sometimes you can peg them. They walk into the visitation, and it's like they've got an entourage, and and they want everyone to stop and to talk to them, because if their feathers are not being stroked, then something's wrong with you, not me. That's sad, but that's sometimes the case. And sometimes, unfortunately, in a family grief situation, there will be some folks who are expecting to be seen and heard over and again. Don?
Lady in Kentucky said eating alone.
Eating alone.
How hard that was.
Yes. What else?
Exhausted.
Ooh, that's a great one. Exhausted. Because if you're dealing with grief 24/7, and you're dealing with all the decisions that have to be made and all the things that come about after a grief loss, it can be exhausting. What else?
Eternity.
Eternity. There you go. What else? Emotional. Which is why it's, because of emotional, it's exhausting. Because our emotions are just everywhere. We go from waking up in the morning feeling good, and then someone says something or someone texts something to us, and we get mad, and then we feel guilty because we get mad, and then someone else comes in and wants you to make a decision, and it can be an exhausting, emotional roller coaster. What else? Yes, ma'am. Engulfed. Ooh, that's a good one. I think it's, where is it that David said, Psalm 142:4, I looked on my right hand, I looked on my left, and no man cared for me, no one saw me, no one cared for my soul. He was literally engulfed in his grief to the point that nobody, as far as he could tell, really cared whether he was there or not. Exactly. And then the last one, F. Feelings. Which is why we grieve, because of all the feelings. Friendship. What else? Final. Fear. Frantic. Here's another one. Forever. Fatigue. Forgiveness. Thank you. That's an excellent one. Frustration or frustrated. Forgetful. I'm sorry, what was it? Frightened. Okay. Mr. Webster says, individual experience, painful sorrow or emotion of an actual loss or precedes an anticipatory loss. We've taken grief and we've given words and word pictures to that grief. Now let me just show you. If grief was just guilt and retrospect and irrational and exhausting and fearful, would that be enough to deal with in your life? It would be enough, but guess what? It's everything. And then some. And that's why we grieve. And that's why we're exhausted. And that's why we can't sometimes think straight. And that's why sometimes we want to blame God or somebody else. And that's why we hurt. So tonight what we've tried to do, besides asking questions about what grief is and what it's not, is we've tried to sort of expand your horizons and say grief is caused by much more than just one thing and one thing only, although that's terrible itself. And then we've tried to give you word ideas of what grief really is. Tomorrow, we're going to get back together again tomorrow evening at 6:30 again, right? And we're going to talk about, the first thing we're going to look at is what everybody needs to know about grief. Because, I think I probably know the answer to this question. Besides my brother and I, has anyone ever attended a grief workshop like this? A little bit different, okay. It's very unusual that even anybody raises their hands. Because let's face it, you want me to come to a workshop about grief? Think about it. Either you're going to grieve over losses in your life, or someone's going to grieve over your loss. 100% of people deal with grief. The last time I checked, the more you know about a subject, the better off you'll be. So think about people that maybe you had already said you were going to tell them about the class. Hopefully you've learned something that will cause you to want to call them tomorrow, invite them to come, and we'll be back again tomorrow evening at 6:30. Troy, I'm going to turn it back over to you at this time. Thanks so much again for those who are online with us. If you have questions or anything that you'd like to submit, or if you folks are here would like to do so, let us know.
Thank you, sir.